Biden, 5 points behind Trump in the Fox News poll in March, is now 2 points ahead of Trump in the Fox News poll in June. A top Midwestern political reporter says the Trump campaign is now warning local media that it will vet all questions for Trump at the Republican convention and only give access to Trump to those local outlets whose questions have been approved in advance and 1 week before the debate, as rumors continue to swirl that Trump will back out as soon as he can find some way to blame it on Biden. It is not only a certainty now that Robert Kennedy Jr. will not be at the debate, but it's beginning to look like he is on far fewer state ballots than his campaign has been claiming. The Fox polling first. Trump has led the Fox Beacon-Shaw poll every month since October. He was still ahead last month by a point. Trump also led Biden in the 5-candidate version of the Fox poll by 5 points in March, by 6 points last November, and Biden is now also ahead in that crowded field by 1 point. There are 3 remarkable internal numbers. Doesn't sound like much, but Fox says 32% of its respondents now believe the economy is in excellent or good shape, and that is the high watermark for the entire Biden presidency. Fox also says voter confidence in Biden on the economy has swung wildly towards the president. They favor Trump by 5 points on the issue, but last month they favored Trump over Biden by 13 points. And Fox's poll also suggests that 73% of black voters support Biden. Fox notes, I'll say that again, Fox notes that at this point in 2020, their poll said he had the support of 79% of black voters and wound up hugely overperforming in that number, getting 91% of the actual votes. So, Fox says Biden has a slim lead over Trump among registered voters, and within that, a 3-point swing in 1 month, a 7-point swing in 3 months. He has an 8-point swing towards Biden on the economy, and he has the highest approval on the economy he has ever had. So, what is the headline sitting atop the Fox News website story about the Fox News poll now showing Biden ahead of Trump and surging? Quote, Fox News poll, Biden-Trump matchup tilts toward one candidate. If their viewers and readers go to their homepage and they do not click through, they will assume Trump is surging in the polls when in fact his support is ebbing away. Yes, it sure looks like the scene in Citizen Kane where Orson Welles loses the election and they have to choose which banner headline to print on his newspaper, and they go with fraud at polls. But contrary to the other meme, you do have to give them credit. Fox is corrupt as hell, but they are really good at it. And as a postscript to this, that 7.3-month swing to Biden represents perfect timing in one respect. Axios has now published this headline, "One big thing, Dems fear Biden loss," over a piece insisting Biden is losing in every poll and has made no progress in any poll. And it trashes everything about the Biden campaign. And it quotes yet another disaffected, semi-conservative, ex-Democrat you were not sure was still alive named Howard Wolfson, saying if the election were today, Biden would lose it. Saying that Biden learned the wrong lessons about 2020 and 2022 and is mistaken in hitting Trump on his convictions and his dictatorship. Says Biden only won in 2020 because Democrats coalesced to stave off Bernie Sanders. And the Axios story includes the phrase, quote, many senior Democrats, including some of President Biden's aides, doubt his theory for victory, which relies on voter fears about January 6th, political violence, democracy, and Donald Trump's character. And yet, the Axios piece never actually says on what Biden should be running instead. And that's just the worst of the kind of piece that looks like it should have been narrated by a shibboleth Sean Hannity. It gets posted It's their lead story, and hours later, out comes a Fox poll showing Biden ahead and surging, and even surging on the economy a week before the first debate. And there's more signs of Trump panic, trading interview access to Trump in exchange for letting the campaign vet your questions to Trump. Ask a question about, of all things, the 2020 election, and you're gone? Yes, according to the political editor of the NBC television affiliate in St. Louis, Mark Maxwell of Channel 5 KSDK. This is not some local liberal. This is a standard play-it-straight local TV politics specialist. And what he said in an interview with Heartland Signal and its radio station WCPO that they released virally yesterday is probably not as shocking as it should be, given the fact that Trump has corrupted everything he's come close to, except perhaps the Visiting Nurse Association. It's not as shocking as it should be to hear this, but it's still pretty shocking.
I plan to cover the Republican National Convention, Democratic National Convention this summer. I have been hearing from some of my friends in local media who are also planning to be there from across the country that the Trump campaign is already trying to vet their questions. And they're saying, look, if you play nice, we might give you some airtime. You'll feel real important. You can talk to the former president, put him on your airwaves. But if you ask about the 2020 election, you're out. People that I'm hearing from are saying, like, well, that's bogus. We're not going to play ball like that. I mean, it's not how this works. You don't get to screen our questions. But for as much as they bluster about 2020 being stolen and all this, they're very sensitive to it. They don't like the topic.
Mark Maxwell of KSDK St. Louis. Why would they try to stop people from asking Trump about the 2020 election? Because when Trump is talking about the 2020 election, he is not talking about the economy. And going back to that Fox poll, his trust lead over Biden on the economy just dropped about 60% in 1 month. And when Trump is talking about the 2020 election, he is not talking about immigration. And again, going back to the Fox poll, his trust lead over Biden on immigration dropped from 13 points to 9 points in 1 month. And the same Trump campaign bosses who Rick Wilson said day before yesterday are telling journalists off the record they can't control their candidate anymore, are convinced that his edge is on the economy and on immigration, and he's pissing it away talking about the wrong election. There, of course, is one other large reason they don't want Trump talking about 2020 to local TV reporters or anybody else, because when he does, he sounds even more crazy than usual. Ramin Satuda, the author of the new book on The Apprentice, with even more jaw-droppers from his 6 different interviews with Trump, like how he confidently told me that Joan Rivers voted for him when he ran for president. Joan Rivers died on September 4th, 2014. And if, like me, you were thinking, well, maybe she voted for him in a primary in 2011, 2012. Didn't he start to run in 2011, 2012? Trump pulled out before the primaries started. Satuda also says that in one of his other interviews, that his first interview with Trump was more than a month after Trump was thrown out of office, quote, "There was one day where Trump told me he needed to go upstairs to deal with Afghanistan." Unless that is a metaphor for the call of nature. In March 2021 or later, Trump either thought he was still president of the United States and had to go deal with Afghanistan, or he thought he could get away with lying to a magazine editor and author that he was still president and had to go deal with Afghanistan, either of which is, nuts. The more you hear, we are now still less than 48 hours after Trump called President Biden Joe Bride. The more you hear, the more you listen to that story from St. Louis that the Trump campaign wants to know the questions in advance, and the more you ask yourself, they only want to know the questions in advance? I mean, at Trump's rate of decline, They're going to start providing the reporters with the only questions they are allowed to ask him, or they may start just handing out tapes of Trump answering questions asked by himself. Okay, so what about the debate? And would Kennedy sue to get into the debate? Well, this much is clear. The Washington Post has concluded there is no way Bob Kennedy meets the qualifications to be on the stage at CNN headquarters in Atlanta 1 week from tonight. The deal is presumptive nominee of one of the two major parties. You can be on the stage, or you're in an outside party that's on enough state ballots to earn at least 270 electoral votes, and you are getting 15% or more in at least 4 respected national polls. Leaving aside the question whether or not there are 4 respected national polls, the Washington Post says so far, if the RFK Jr. campaign won all the states where he's actually on the ballot, he would get an electoral vote count of 100. That would be Delaware, Michigan, Oklahoma, Tennessee, and Utah, all of which say he has qualified, and California and Hawaii, where Kennedy is not yet on the ballot, but is the presumptive nominee of smaller parties which have already begun the process of qualifying. Everywhere else, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. says he is on the ballot, he is definitely wrong, and he may be lying. The Post reports that in California, Florida, Hawaii, South Carolina, and Texas, Kennedy has done some of the work, submitted ballot petitions, or been nominated by a party that previously qualified in that state, but that he has not been officially certified yet in any of those. This is how precarious it is for Kennedy in Florida. In Florida, he has been nominated for president by the Reform Party, the Ross Perot Reform Party. Ross Perot, the third-party independent who helped sink the first George Bush in 1992. Ross Perot died in 2019, and Ross Perot's Reform Party died last year, and it dropped off the ballot in Florida. They are trying to re-qualify and then in turn qualify Kennedy as the Reform Party candidate, but nothing is said in Florida. So back to the immediate concern that the only way Kennedy will be at the debate is in spirit. Hell, I'll be at the debate in spirit. We'll be doing another live countdown podcast right after the debate on YouTube, just like the one the night of the State of the Union. But will Trump be there? And if he's there, will he really be, there? Even the New York Times has put out a piece suggesting Trump is lowering expectations for his own success and what he's told his cult will be Biden's failure. And again, circling back to that Fox poll, they actually asked their registered voters who will win next Thursday, as if there has been anything resembling a consensus about who won a given presidential debate since Ronald Reagan. They are picking Trump, but only by 50 to 45. They also asked how important several key issues are to voters' decisions on who to choose, and the vaguely phrased ones get basically 98% somewhat, very, or extremely important. Like the candidate's leadership skills, are they somewhat, very, or extremely important? The candidate's age and mental soundness, are they very, blah, 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 blah. You might as well ask if you will choose between them based on which one of them is the old white dude. But the answers to the how important to your vote is the candidate's performance in the debates, that's at least a little sharpened. I think it's fair to say nobody is rooting for their candidate to do an Ian McKellen into the orchestra pit. They expect their guy's performance to be at least intelligible. 30% say that performance is extremely important to their vote. 25% say very important. 31% say somewhat important, meaning that the I don't give a crap about the debate number is only 13%. That's not a lot. And it again underscores a question being seriously asked behind the scenes at the Trump campaign and, of course, in public, loudly and seriously pitched by the Trump campaign about Biden. What happens if Trump calls Biden Obama during the debate? What if Biden doesn't do any of the dubious things the right-wing echo chamber has lied about? What if Trump starts talking about how in 1988 he got voted for by Joan Rivers or Johnny Rivers or Doc Rivers? Over the weekend in Detroit, at the black church all the white people go to, Trump suggested he might deliberately lose the debate to make sure Joe Biden does not drop out of the campaign. Drop out, to be replaced as the Democratic candidate by the former First Lady, Joan Rivers. I'll be there. I'll be at the debate, at least on YouTube. Also of interest here, I already quoted Citizen Kane once, and I'm going to do it again. Fox had to pay Dominion Voting Systems $787.5 million to settle its lawsuit over Fox's lies about Dominion Voting Systems. But now a Fox host is insisting all the videos Fox has doctored and clipped and decontextualized, they are all legit and not doctored and not clipped and not decontextualized, and it's everybody else who is lying about Fox. The Citizen Kane quote, "If it was anybody else, I'd say that what's going to happen to you would be a lesson to you, only you're going to need more than one lesson, and you're going to get more than one lesson." That's next. This is Countdown.
This is Countdown with Keith Olbermann.
This is Sports Center. Wait, check that. Not anymore. This is Countdown with Keith Olbermann.
In sports, Dateline Birmingham, Alabama. The Negro Leagues tribute game will proceed as scheduled tonight. It is now not a salute to, but a memorial to the late Willie Mays. His San Francisco Giants playing the St. Louis Cardinals at Rickwood Field in Birmingham, where Mays made his professional debut 3/4 of a century ago. Fox has the telecast. Fox could not be bothered to put an African-American announcer or analyst in its announce booth. As the tributes continue to pour in for Mays, who died Tuesday afternoon at the age of 93, I did want to mention one snapshot of one small trivial moment in his career that illustrates something not being frequently mentioned in the descriptions of the extraordinary talents of Willie Mays. His extraordinary intelligence, how much he knew about the game he played. On the 25th of July in 1967 at Candlestick Park in San Francisco, the Giants and the visiting New York Mets were scoreless in the bottom of the third inning. Jesus Alou and Bobby Etheridge of the Giants singled, and Willie Mays was up next, and he lined a sure two-base hit, a double that scored Alou. But as Etheridge chugged into third base, Mays stunned everybody in the ballpark. He deliberately stopped at first base. No injury, no stumble, no hesitation, no misreading of the play, no fear of the outfielder's arm. He just turned a double into a single. And he explained later that he had done so deliberately, that he had turned a double into a single, so that first base would not be open, unoccupied, and so the Mets would not then walk the next Giants hitter, the slugger Jim Ray Hart, so that the Mets pitcher Jack Fisher could pitch instead to first baseman Jack Hyatt, who hit after Hart did. Mays said he knew that Hart hit Fisher very well. Now, this is pre-internet. In 1967, this is pre-pitcher versus hitter matchup data. This is almost pre-scouting. Willie Mays just knew that Hart hit this pitcher Jack Fisher real well. And because first base was not open, the Mets did not intentionally walk Hart, and Hart promptly hit a 3-run homer off Jack Fisher, and the Giants wound up winning 5-4. If you look it up now, you will find out that lifetime, this Jim Ray Hart hit .339 lifetime in 62 plate appearances against Jack Fisher, the highest that Hart hit against any pitcher he faced more than 45 times in his career. And before we could look that up somewhere, Willie Mays knew that. So yes, the catch, the home runs, the stolen bases, the ability to judge what was going to happen next, yes, all of it valid and to be remembered forever about Willie Mays. But the fact that Willie Mays turned his double into a single so that Jim Ray Hart would get to hit against the pitcher he hit really well, and Jim Ray Hart hit the home run that guaranteed the Giants' victory, that's who Willie Mays really was. Dateline Toronto, Ontario in Canada. Infielder Justin Turner of the Blue Jays, generally speaking, one of the more thoughtful of baseball's players, has had one of the worst ideas of all time. Appearing on the Foul Territory TV streaming show, Mr. Turner was asked what he would do if they let him be commissioner for a day, and he has suggested expanding baseball to 32 teams, scrapping the current American and National League formats, and rearranging things so that the World Series every year would be an Eastern team versus a Western team. The television audience for the Baseball World Series peaked in 1978. It was an average of 44 million viewers per game. Last year, the average was just under 5 million viewers per game. So the audience is about 1/10 what it was in 1978, even though the population is 1/3 larger than it was in 1978. Why did the World Series die? 1,000 reasons, but one of them shows up in what happened to the ratings starting about 1996. The Braves and the Yankees still got 25 million viewers per game that year. Then the next season, they began interleague play. Teams from the American League and the National League had never faced each other except in exhibitions or in the World Series since the American League opened for business in 1901. The point was the teams and the leagues were distinct. The World Series was utterly novel, and it was that thing that all sports leagues try to fabricate today, an actual organic rivalry between everybody who followed the American League and everybody who followed the National League. Most American League fans hated the National League, or at least disrespected it, and vice versa. This was true because, well, I'll give you this example. When my grandfather died in 1987, he died hating the American League. He would watch the World Series and the All-Star Game and root against the American League team. He would mock the American League New York Yankees. He would insist they played in the weaker league than did his National League New York Mets. His hatred in 1987 owed to something that had happened in July of 1903. He was a little boy then when the star shortstop of his National League New York Giants, George Stacey Davis, jumped to the Chicago White Sox of the brand new American League. That had been in 1902. In 1903, Davis jumped back to the New York Giants, but as part of the peace settlement between the warring leagues that happened right about then, Davis was ordered back to Chicago. Grandpa was still angry about what they did to his Giants 84 years later. Hatreds like that were inherited, cultivated, cherished, maintained. My mother became a New York Yankees fan entirely because her father, my grandfather, was pissed off by that. You may try to create rivalries that resemble that in any sport, in any time. In fact, they form only from true hatred. It was Coke versus Pepsi. It was Ford versus Chevrolet. It was, forgive me, Republican versus Democrat. And then baseball stopped keeping the leagues separate, stopped making the World Series the battle, the only battle between the leagues. And it suddenly didn't mean that much. Interleague play began in 1997. That 1996 World Series audience had been 25 million viewers a game. Within 4 years, they were down to 18 million per game. Since 2004, when the Red Sox played and finally won, the average has been more than 20 million viewers a game only once. It was last as many as 14 million 6 years ago. If you want to make the World Series live again, you have to make it interesting to fans whose personal teams are not playing in it. That used to be everybody, because you were a fan of a team, but also a fan of a league. That may not be salvageable. It may be too late. But what baseball should do is eliminate interleague play immediately and see if it can bring the league versus league rivalry back to life. And if that doesn't work, try something else stupid like East versus West or alphabetical order versus numerical, or who knows what. Because Grandpa wasn't just still angry about George Stacey Davis 84 years later. He was also convinced that the National League played real baseball, but that the American League was not only weak and bad, but that it was fixed. Fixed so that the Yankees would win the pennant nearly every year. You can't buy that kind of devotion from customers. The crazy has to be organic. I'm sorry, Justin Turner, baseball has been steadily eliminating the crazy, and it has made its World Series small. Thank you, Nancy Faust. Still ahead of us on this edition of Countdown, it's hot here. I mean, it's not that hot. It's hotter in a lot of other places here, and it's only going to get hotter. And there was a nice strong wind here yesterday, and that is often the difference between life and death in this city. Above ground, anyway, not in the subways. In the subways where it's always hellish. And when they say the real feel is 92 degrees, I flash back to the relatively recent past here when not all of our subway cars had air conditioning. And that, in turn, reminds me of the morning I got into one of those non-air-conditioned subway cars after having had a few beers the day and the night before, like 40 beers. Coming up in Things I Promise Not to Tell. But first, there are still more new idiots to talk about, the daily roundup of the miscreants, morons, and Dunning-Kruger effect specimens who we celebrate as today's worst persons in the world. The bronze, worse, and this is going to piss off a lot of reporters. David Carr, the former media reporter and long-form writer of the New York Times. This is kind of unfair because he's dead. He died in 2015. He died in the Times newsroom. But I was surprised to have just discovered that Georgetown University held an event this week honoring Carr's memory, in which David Carr was saluted by a room full of former colleagues and other journalists. Let me state at the outset that I've never heard anybody who worked with him who said anything except that David Carr was the best mentor in the world, that he was a singular influence in their success, that he was a constant inspiration and support, and I don't doubt any of that, not for a moment, nor that his recovery from addiction was inspirational and heroic, and he was such a crack addict at one point that he once left his newborn twins in a freezing car, and they were underweight because his girlfriend was also an addict. He left them in a freezing car so he could go buy and use more drugs. That's how bad it was, and he overcame that. Journalists can celebrate a good man, an inspiration, a friend. That's not what I'm criticizing. But please do not do what they also did, which was to celebrate David Carr as a good journalist. I noticed this when he died in February 2015. The grief and the plaudits filled social media and touched my heart. There were dozens, probably hundreds, and they were all reporters and colleagues. There was not one word from anyone, as near as I could tell, not one word from anybody that David Carr had reported on or written about. Often that happens. People tell tough truths and are hated for telling the tough truths. It's happened to me every once in a while. But that's not what happened here. That happened here because David Carr constantly violated the most basic premises of journalism. He did a story on me for the Times in 2011. I was warned by people he had written about before, don't let him talk to you. He's already written the piece in his head. It was 3,000 words. I guess it was okay. I remember not liking it when it came out. I read it again the other day, and it was kind of foolish. They spent some money on a cartoon of me. The cartoon looked nice. The publicity was great when I needed it for a new show on a new network. But the point is, when the article was written, NBC had just breached my contract, and we had settled that with an agreement full of non-disparagement clauses and non-disclosure agreements, blah, blah, blah. They couldn't trash me. I couldn't trash them. There was an arbitrator who oversaw this, who eventually fined NBC like $100,000 for violating it, for disparaging me anyway. And I had also left to start a rival news organization at Current TV, and then, as now, NBC likes to dirty people up when they leave NBC. And they were going to dirty me up. And I told David Carr all this. Some of it I told him on the record, and some of it I couldn't tell him about then. And he even put it in the piece. He even inadvertently may have identified one of his anonymous sources for this story. He wrote of MSNBC's president, who was notorious for calling up New York writers at the Post and the Daily News and the Times and offering them off-the-record comments. He wrote, quote, Phil Griffin, who was president of MSNBC, did not return calls or emails requesting a comment. Employees of MSNBC were prevented from speaking on the record by non-disclosure agreements signed when Olbermann left. And by the way, at that point, it was a violation of the non-disclosure agreement to acknowledge there was a non-disclosure agreement. NBC violated it, even telling him that. And note his use of that word on the record, because David Carr granted at least one NBC employee the right to say anything they wanted off the record about me, which actually is fine, except in one set of circumstances, except if there's one problem. Whoever he talked to lied to him. Carr wrote that I isolated myself in my office to avoid people. No, I was isolating myself in my office to write an hour's worth of scripts. He wrote that I might have felt slighted, underappreciated, and ignored at MSNBC. That never happened. I felt a lot of things there, but I never felt ignored. I often felt, leave me alone. I never felt ignored. He wrote that I made demands for a renegotiated contract and an extension. I never demanded a renegotiated contract nor an extension. When we tried to settle the breach of contract, I offered some terms under which I would stay and asked for their terms. I don't know if that was the same thing, but I never demanded a contract renegotiation. Quote, there were times when he threatened not to come to work. Not true. Not once. He wrote that there were substitute hosts on standby if I didn't show up, which happened once in 1998 when the substitute host was on standby. His name was John Gibson, and he was there because I had kidney stones. Only time it happened. He didn't mention the kidney stones. He wrote that very senior people spent hours talking him, that would be me, off a ledge and into the town car that would take him to the studio. Not once. Not ever. Quote, when he wasn't threatening not to show up, he was threatening to quit. Never did either of those things. Carr wrote that my criticisms of Fox News, and this was the part that really did piss me off, were mere enmity, that was the word he used, because I needed an enemy on the air. It's not true. They were in there because in 2011, Fox News was on its way to becoming what it is now. And people like him did not believe that was going to happen. And so they just assumed I was doing it to get ratings. Now, again, sometimes untrue things get into the newspapers, even into the New York Times. Even that many in one story is not enough to slam a guy nearly a decade after he died in the middle of their newsroom. Sources embellish, sources spin, sources lie to you, and a reporter cannot always check everything for the truth or non-truth behind the fact that the guy said it. But the reason I have pointed out all of these stories in detail, all of these stories gotten anonymously from somebody or many somebodies at NBC, is that even though the late David Carr spent a full day with me and did a separate long interview with me on another day and sent countless follow-up emails with further questions, he never asked me about any of those stories. He never asked me about the supposed threats not to show up, the ones that didn't happen, and not the stuff about the substitute host who was on standby because, kidney stones. None of it. He never asked me. New York Times reporter, media reporter, never asked me to confirm, contradict, deny, or no comment. Never asked me. And most journalists will tell you that if you don't ask the subject of your story about a negative tale about them, or a sourced piece of information, or something anonymously given to you, or some gossip, the reason you are not asking is you don't want a good paragraph or anecdote to be destroyed by a denial or by being disproved. David Carr never asked me about any of those juicy pieces of gossip which weren't true, which he didn't check. And there's something else that seems to me that erases any reasons to hold him up as a role model for journalists. One of the classic switcheroos reporters use, it was suggested to me once and I just couldn't do it, is to ask the subject of your story to do something and then you leave out the fact that you asked. You make it look like the subject of the story just did it. There are 3 references, at least in this story, to the media blitz that I was doing and my flogging my new show. There is not one reference to the fact that David Carr asked to interview me, not the other way around. To read the piece, you would think he did not ask me endless follow-up questions by email. In the story, that became many late-night email conversations that were part of a blitz of press to advance my career. Over dinner at a game at Yankee Stadium, I paid for his ticket. He and the Times never reimbursed me, by the way. He asked me to explain in as much detail as possible the technical process of reading the teleprompter on TV. So I did, in intricate detail. Well, mostly I quoted Tom Snyder's intricate technical explanation of the teleprompter. He closed the piece with 3+ paragraphs about that are designed to make it look like I just launched into it. Never says he asked. It begins with, he knows exactly what to do when the red light on the camera beckons him to begin talking. And the piece ends with, he looked like that guy on television, the one who likes the camera. Yeah, no, I was just answering his question. I hadn't thought of David Carr or the story or this little journalism ethics limbo dance that he did. Hadn't thought of him or it for years. I certainly hadn't spent all the time since 2015 thinking, when's the right time to trash a dead guy from the Times who broke all their journalistic rules at my expense? And considering that ticket literally at my expense. But a couple of months ago, one of my friends who Carr interviewed for the piece brought up the interview. Something had reminded her about it, and she wanted to tell me she was still furious at the questions he asked her the moment I left the room. Tell me the worst thing you can about him. It was 13 years ago. She's madder now than I was then. And then came the social media stuff from the thing at Georgetown, remembering his work. So again, the people who were there, Jake Tapper, Amanda Ripley, Eric Wemple, Brian Stelter, others, they get together to honor a departed friend, to honor a mentor, to salute the memory of a courageous inspiration. I honor them for doing that. But let's not pave over reality here. Nobody he wrote about said anything about him when he died. Not anything nice, just not anything. As a journalist, the late David Carr was a corner cutter. You may want to be the David Carr kind of colleague. You do not want to be the David Carr kind of journalist. Okay, back to this decade and the living, sort of, the runner-up worser, Trump again. ETTD, every team Trump touches dies. This he wrote on Saturday night. Wow, comma, the Florida Panthers are a fantastic ice hockey team. They're 3-0 against the very good Edmonton Oilers from Canada. They're down 1-0 tonight, but it's still early. Hopefully they will put them away. Very impressive. In sports, we call this bandwagoning. And ETTD, or ETTTD. The Florida Panthers were leading the Stanley Cup Finals in ice hockey. Who the hell calls it ice hockey? For those of you who've just arrived on Earth, it's ice hockey. They were leading 3-0, and they were only trailing the Edmonton Oilers in Game 4, 1-0. 2 goals, and they win the Stanley Cup when Trump wrote and posted what I just read you. And then they went to hell in a Trump basket. Florida lost that 4th game Saturday night, not 1-0, but a little bit worse than that. They gave up 8 goals. They lost 8-1. Then Tuesday night, they lost again missing the chance to clinch the Stanley Cup, 5-3. They now lead Edmonton 3-2. And Edmonton's chance to tie the series up and set up Florida for the worst choke in hockey history is Friday night. Because ETTD, every team Trump touches dies. But our winner, the worst, Greg Gutfeld of Fox. Fox has been actively altering and editing video of the president to make him seem feeble or lost, when, of course, it is the boy they pimp for, Trump, who called the president Joe Bride, who called his own Dr. Ronnie Jackson Ronnie Johnson, and that's just since Sunday. Stay tuned, there'll be more. But that's what they do. Fox News, they're whores. That's what I tried to tell David Carr in 2011, and he wrote it up like it was just a marketing scheme for MSNBC or Current TV. Gutfeld wins this award today because he went a little further than just being a whore. He insisted on air that it's everybody else who's lying, it's not Fox. Quote, when we see something, we vet it. The media does not, because they're the engine behind their hoaxes. The Dems and the media are lucky we don't match their dishonesty. By the way, Fox News, top-rated cable TV network or cable news network, always, often the top-rated cable TV network, they're the media. They're, in fact, the establishment media. Anyway, to resume Gutfeld's quote, when we see something, we vet it. The media does not, because they're the engine behind their hoaxes. The Dems and the media are lucky we don't match their dishonesty. We could. We don't. We don't have to, because basically, we don't have to make up crap. Well, of course you don't have to make up crap, Gutfeld. It's provided to you by Rupert Murdoch. Greg, you don't make up crap. You just paid Dominion $787,500,000 to settle their suit against you for making up crap because Rupert Murdoch had too much money. Gutfeld, today's worst person in the world! It's not a marketing ploy. To the number one story on the countdown and my favorite topic, me and how I learned not to drink. Anybody over the age of 27, and the number may actually be way lower than that, can look back in genuine horror at a day on which they did something alarming or potentially physically injurious or fatal at a much younger age. For me, since the day I turned 23 and a half on July 27th, 1982, that day was July 25th, 1982. And I remember on my 23rd and a half birthday being kind of surprised that I had made it through the previous 3 days. July 25th, 1982 was one of those timeless, airless, stultifying summer Sundays in New York that can arrive and sit on your head and do its best to smother you. It can get there anytime from the end of May until the middle of September. I was invited to a party on Long Island. Syosset, maybe? Where 9 college friends were already having a great time drinking. My friend Peter rented a duplex there and shared it with some radio colleagues of his, including, impossibly, the former New York Rangers hockey player Pete Stemkowski. My friend Glenn Cornelius, who we would lose when he turned 39 and whose name is on the studios of our Cornell radio station's new facility, along with my dad's, was there. He was in charge of grilling the burgers. And his wife was there, Then my friend Peter's parents and a pal who used to be Pat Lyons in a T-shirt, but is now Patrick J. Lyons of the foreign desk of the New York Times, thank you, in a beard and a three-piece suit that makes him look like Britain's ambassador to this country in 1897. I mention all this because it is in my diary for the next day. I don't actually remember it, and I don't actually remember it because it was so damn hot that I would not leave Peter's well-air-conditioned living room even to go grab a burger that Glenn Cornelius was fixing with expert precision. I just sat there. And drank beer. Mind you, I didn't drink a lot in college or thereafter. I was never once carded in my life. I think I got my first bar beer at the age of 13. But as of that day in 1982, I don't believe I had ever had something to drink on 3 consecutive days, and I probably hadn't had anything to drink on 2 consecutive days more than 4 or 5 times in my life. But that day was so oppressive, so unpleasant, that I just kept drinking beer. And I did not stop from my arrival at 2 or 3 p.m. until my departure just before 10. I had a beer in my hand for 7, 8 hours without interruption. In those days, if I stuck to one kind of beverage, I would neither stay obviously drunk nor would I get a hangover. I do not know how many beers I had that stultifying afternoon and evening. If I only got a new beer every 15 minutes, that would still be 28 or 30 beers. Might have been less. Might have been more. My guess is it was more, closer to 40. I recall having the presence of mind to ask my friends Peter, Pat, and Glenn not merely to take me to the train station so I could get back to my apartment in the city, but to stay with me on the platform to make sure I got on the train rather than falling in front of it. I also remember them going so far as to make sure not just that I got on, but that I sat down. And I recall being overjoyed at the train's air conditioning, considering that at 10 p.m. that night, at the train station, it was still 90 degrees out. I'm pretty sure I splurged, and it was a splurge in those days, for a cab back from Penn Station to my home on the other side of town, even though my salary as the national sports correspondent for CNN was $26,000 a year. And never once in all of this boozy time did I forget that not only was I due in at CNN at 9:30 the following morning, but that I was also due in at my part-time job as the backup sportscaster on a New York radio station, WNEW, at 4 the next morning. It was past 11 p.m. when I got into my apartment, whose air conditioner was poorly designed for the purpose and did little but blow air around, though still wobbly from drink. 28 beers, 30, 40. I immediately set 2 alarms for 3 a.m., 4 hours hence. I got a huge block of ice out of my freezer. I put it in the tub in front of my giant room fan. I took a delightful shower. I did not dry off. I simply wrapped myself in my bed sheet, and I fell asleep. I woke up to the alarms 3.5 hours later, slightly less drunk, but not much less drunk. I showered again, shaved, and still drunk, put on a suit, shirt, and tie, checked the temperature, which had cooled all the way down to a balmy 88. And still drunk, I walked, in the middle of the night, through the risky New York of 1982 to the radio station 14 blocks downtown. But of course it was morning. And morning, whether you are drunk or not still drunk, means breakfast. So I stopped at the best all-night diner among several that were open along the route, and I got something to go. Eggs, bacon, and sausage, a little French toast, orange juice, coffee, and of course, 2 pieces of pastry. And I carried it, and I was still drunk, into WNEW Radio, Metro Media Radio in New York. I greeted, still drunk, the newscasters and producers. I grabbed the roll of Sports Wire copy, still drunk, that had been churning out since about 6 p.m. the night before, and still drunk, found the stories I needed, and still drunk while I ate my breakfast that would today sustain me for 3.5 weeks. I wrote my first sportscast to air at 5:30 a.m. I finished it. I looked at the clock. It was 4:30 a.m. So since the sports stories rarely changed on the morning shift, I, still drunk, wrote the 6:30 sportscast as well, and then the 7:30, and still drunk, and it still being only 5:10 a.m., I wrote the last of the sportscasts, the 8:30. In point of fact, drunk, I was working faster than I normally did. A perusal of world history suggests that the stories of the morning included the Yankees losing 6-4 to the Angels, with ex-Yankee Reggie Jackson going 1 for 3 in front of 51,561 sweating fans at Yankee Stadium, that Dave Kingman made 2 unassisted double plays at first base for the Mets as they lost 3-2, with the victorious Padres placing the tragic second baseman Alan Wiggins on the disabled list because he had been arrested for cocaine possession, and that goalie Hubert Birkenheimer starred as the New York Cosmos won their 5th straight game, 11th straight at home over the San Diego Sockers. An ill-fated Olympic sort of thing called the National Sports Festival was well underway in Indianapolis. It was as boring then as it sounds now, no matter how drunk your sportscaster happened to be. At 5:30 a.m., I went on the air, still drunk, and read my script flawlessly. By 6:30, I was beginning to sober up. At 7:30, I was a little headachy. At 8:30, I was now 100% not drunk. I said goodbye to all of my radio colleagues. I checked the temperature, now back up to 93 degrees, and I went out and walked 1 block to the downtown subway train that would take me to the World Trade Center and the 8-hour day that awaited me as a reporter out in the field with a camera crew. And oh, by the way, in 1982, that particular subway line did not have air conditioning. My diary entry leaves out the story that I covered that day for CNN, but it does note that I made a tape of the drunken radio sportscasts and listened that evening and enjoyed them immensely because I had no memory of researching, composing, writing, or reading them whatsoever. My diary also says I made dinner plans with a girl at WNEW who I was dating, and I flirted with another woman at CNN who said that my new publicity photos had made me look like a puppy dog. She and I also made dinner plans. This is like a month and a half of life for me today, or even at the age of 33, let alone 23. I remember either that day or the next, possibly as I listened to the sportscasts I had done while on still drunken autopilot, that it was very impressive to me that I had managed to do all this without swearing on radio or fainting while standing up and holding a CNN microphone out in the 93-degree heat, or getting unwell in front of either of those girls, that I could, in the parlance of those just post-Mad Men years, hold my alcohol. And then I also remembered that just as quickly I remembered, in 1982, the names of some of my father's uncles and some of my mother's cousins, who they had told me had all died around the age of 40, 45, because bluntly, they could also hold their alcohol. Where I got the phrase, I don't know, but I did think of it that night. It's not you are holding your alcohol. It's called functional alcoholism. And functional alcoholism will allow you to drink 40 beers one night and then work from 4 a.m. to 6 p.m. the next. And then later, it'll come back and, kill you. Since that episode in July 1982, the number of times I have had double-digit drinks on one day is 1. I was 37. I was going to a party celebrating what everybody else was believing was me joining their Chicago radio station, but which I alone knew management had instead decided to close that radio station and fire all of them. And before I left my hotel, I took a bunch of the hotel business cards with me because I wasn't sure I'd still be able to speak later that night. And I wanted a card so I could just hand it to the cab driver. And that is exactly what happened. And legitimately, I do not believe that in all the years since then, and that's 1996, I have ever had anything to drink 2 days in a row. And that streak probably goes back to 1982 as well. Never have anything to drink 2 days in a row. And not to preach, but may I suggest that you shouldn't either. I've done all the damage I can do here. Thank you for listening. Countdown musical directors Brian Ray and John Philip Chanel. arranged, produced, and performed most of our music. Mr. Ray was on the guitars, bass, and drums, and Mr. Chanel handled orchestration and keyboards. It was produced by TKO Brothers. Other music, including some of the Beethoven compositions, were arranged and performed by the group No Horns Allowed. The sports music is the Olbermann theme from ESPN2, written by Mitch Warren Davis, courtesy of ESPN Inc. Our satirical and pithy musical comments are by Nancy Faust, the best baseball stadium organist ever. Our announcer is my friend Kenny Mayne, and everything else was, as usual, pretty much my fault. So that's countdown for this, the 140th day until the 2024 presidential election, and the 1,261st day since convicted felon Donald Trump's first attempted coup against the democratically elected government of the United States. Use the July 11th sentencing hearing, use the mental health system, use presidential immunity if it happens, to stop him from doing it again while we still can. A reminder, we will be live again on YouTube after the debate a week from tonight, if Trump shows up. And also, please send your link to this podcast to somebody who does not already listen. It is free, after all. The next scheduled countdown is tomorrow. Bulletins as the news warrants. Till then, I'm Keith Olbermann. Good morning, good afternoon, good night, and good luck.